We all know the famous words in the Declaration of Independence, right? But what about the actual piece of parchment they were written on? Well, that's a whole other story. It's a wild tale of war, of neglect, and some pretty last-minute rescues. So let's dive into the incredible and honestly pretty perilous journey of America's founding document. Yeah, you can forget about a quiet life in a fancy museum. For a huge part of its life, the Declaration was basically a fugitive. It was constantly being moved, stuffed into whatever bag was lying around, always just, one step ahead of total disaster. It wasn't just a document, it was a refugee. And that really is the question, isn't it? Because its survival was anything but guaranteed. I mean, from the battlefields of the Revolution all the way to the threats of the 20th century, the Declaration's journey is a legitimate historical thriller. So let's trace its path, from the moment it was created to its final high-tech preservation. Okay, so to really get this story, we have to go all the way back to the beginning, the summer of 1776. This was a time of incredibly intense debate and, let's be honest, unbelievable risk. This wasn't just some philosophical essay. Signing this piece of paper was a literal act of treason. And things moved so fast. In just about a year, the colonies went from, hey, can we have our rights back, to declaring all-out rebellion. Once King George III made his proclamation and Thomas Paine's common sense started spreading like wildfire, the momentum was just unstoppable. It led directly to Richard Henry Lee standing up and making that bold proposal for independence. So, to put this radical idea into words, Congress put together a committee of its biggest heavy hitters. You had John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, but they chose one guy to do the actual writing. A 33-year-old delegate from Virginia named Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson himself remembered it that way years later. He said everyone else on the committee basically turned to him and said, you do it. So he did. He wrote the first draft, showed it to Adams and Franklin for a few tweaks, and then he presented it to Congress. And that's when the real editing began. And this right here, this is like the ghost of a sentence. Jefferson's original draft included this fiery takedown of the slave trade, calling it a cruel war against human nature. But to get every colony on board, to get that unanimous vote they so desperately needed, Congress cut the entire passage. It's just a powerful reminder that from the very beginning, the Declaration was a product of some really fierce debate and some very difficult compromises. So the words are agreed upon, the document is signed, and that's when its most dangerous chapter kicks off. Think about it. The Continental Congress was the government of a nation at war, which means they were constantly on the move. And the Declaration, well, it went right along with them. I mean, just look at this travel schedule. The Declaration was constantly being packed up and thrown into a light wagon. From Philly to Baltimore, then this crazy dash through Lancaster and York in Pennsylvania. It didn't find anything close to a permanent home until the government finally settled in Washington, D.C. in 1800. But even that piece, it wasn't going to last. Yep, just 14 years later, war was back on American soil. It's August 1814. British forces are marching on Washington, and they have orders to burn the Capitol to the ground. And the nation's most important records, including the Declaration, were sitting right in the path of destruction. The scramble to save everything was absolutely desperate. We're talking last minute. There were no special containers. Instead, a clerk named Stephen Pleasanton ran out, bought some coarse linen, had it sewn into bags, and then frantically stuffed the country's founding documents inside while the enemy was literally marching on the city. Okay, so it survived 2 wars. You'd think it would finally be safe, right? Well, now the Declaration faced a new, much quieter enemy: time. And for almost 100 years, the very people who were supposed to protect it subjected it to conditions that almost completely destroyed it. Just let this number sink in for a second. For 35 critical years, from 1841 all the way to 1876, this priceless document was put on public display in what was basically the worst possible environment imaginable. And this wasn't just any old room. The Declaration was hung up in the old Patent Office building, directly across from a huge window. For 35 years, direct sunlight just blasted this delicate parchment day in and day out, causing the ink to fade at a really alarming rate. And if the sunlight wasn't bad enough, get this. Back in the 1820s, somebody wanted to make a really popular engraving of it. So they used something called a wet transfer process. That means they pressed a damp piece of paper right onto the original document, literally lifting some of the ink off the parchment. In trying to share the Declaration, they were actively erasing it. By 1870, the damage was terrifyingly obvious. People were starting to panic. This quote from a magazine at the time really captures that feeling. They were reporting that the signatures, the names of the men who risked everything, were fading away into nothing. The document was literally disappearing right before their eyes. But thankfully, the alarm bells were finally ringing loud enough for people to listen. The 20th century marked a huge turning point. It was a new era of actually trying, with real science, to stop the decay and finally give the Declaration the protection it always deserved. And here we go again. Once more, the threat of war forces the Declaration into hiding. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, there were real fears that the capital could be attacked, so a top-secret plan was put into motion to get the nation's most precious documents out of harm's way. The difference between the two evacuations is just incredible. Remember that linen bag from 1814? Okay, well, this time, the Declaration was placed in a custom-built 150-pound bronze container, sealed with lead, and then escorted by the Secret Service on a train to the bullion depository at Fort Knox. A little bit of an upgrade. After the war ended, the Declaration came back to Washington, but its final move happened in 1952. It was taken to the place that had been built for it 20 years earlier, the National Archives, a building designed from the ground up to be the most secure, nearly bomb-proof spot in the city. You can just feel the weight of this moment in President Truman's words. This ceremony marked the end of the document's life on the run. It was no longer just a government record. It was now officially being enshrined as a national treasure, to be secured for all the generations to come. And today, its protection is completely state-of-the-art. It sits in an inert helium gas, it's shielded by bulletproof glass, and this high-tech camera system watches it 24/7 for even the tiniest bit of decay. It's a far, far cry from a sunlit window and a linen sack. So the physical document, the actual piece of parchment, against all odds, it survived. It's safe. But that leaves us with one final and maybe more important question. We've mastered the science of preserving the ink and the parchment, but how well are we preserving the ideals written on it? How well are we, today, upholding those self-evident truths for which it stands?